Henry VIII might have been known as a bad husband with a hot temper who straight beheaded a couple of his wives, but he was also surprisingly a talented musician and an animal lover. Henry was a complicated man. Today, we're going to talk about some strange facts that you didn't know about Henry VIII. Henry VIII inherited a thriving and prosperous kingdom from his father, Henry VII. He left behind an enormous fortune, worth the modern equivalent of £375 million or $494 million. And what did Henry VIII do with all that wealth? He wasted it lavishly, recklessly, and spectacularly. Just 1 year after becoming king at the age of 18, Henry had already burned through most of the kingdom's annual revenue on Christmas parties. Yes, Christmas parties. Imagine spending £13.5 million, the equivalent of $18 million, on 1 year of holiday celebrations. That money wasn't just for food, it was for entertainment, lavish gifts, and over-the-top displays of wealth. But Henry didn't stop there. His obsession with grandeur led him to expand the kitchens at Hampton Court Palace until they filled a jaw-dropping 55 rooms. These kitchens prepared banquets that were almost too extravagant to believe. 14-course meals, serving up to 600 people. Henry VIII surrounded himself with a tight-knit circle of trusted servants, but none were closer to the king, quite literally, than his groom of the stool. This peculiar and highly sought-after position came with a very unique responsibility: managing the king's royal business. Yes, you heard that right. The groom of the stool was tasked with assisting Henry during his most private moments. But this wasn't just a job for the faint of heart. It was a position of incredible privilege and influence. Over Henry's entire reign, only 4 individuals held this coveted role. While they did help the king dress and undress around his royal toilet duties, their influence extended far beyond the chamber pot. These trusted aides controlled access to the king, managed some of his finances, and even wielded immense power through a stamp bearing Henry's signature. When courting his eventual second wife, Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII revealed a very different side of himself, one that was, frankly, a little thirsty. The king penned her a series of love letters, playing it completely uncool and wearing his heart on his sleeve as he agonized over her coyness. These letters, which have somehow survived to this day, are, well, let's just say they're not exactly subtle. One opens with the line, "My mistress and friend, I and my heart put ourselves in your hands, begging you to have them suitors for your good favor." And then in one letter, Henry writes, "Wishing myself, specially in evening, in my sweetheart's arms, whose duckies I trust shortly to kiss." Yep, you guessed it. Duckies was Henry's way of referring to Anne's boobs. Basically, Henry VIII invented the Tudor-era equivalent of a late-night "you-up" text. It's almost hard to believe that the same man writing these sappy, lovesick notes would one day have Anne executed. Henry VIII is famously remembered for being anti-pope, a king who broke from the Catholic Church in a dramatic split. But what might surprise you is that, in his younger years, Henry was actually a devoted supporter of Catholicism. In fact, Pope Leo X was so impressed with Henry's loyalty to the Church that he granted him the prestigious title of Defensor Fidei, or Defender of the Faith. And England's monarchs still carry that title to this day, despite Henry's eventual break with Rome. Henry's early devotion wasn't just symbolic. He sent tin from Cornwall to help decorate the roof of Pope Julius II's grand new palace, a clear sign of his dedication. Believe it or not, young Henry was even rumored to have been destined for the church himself, until the untimely death of his older brother changed everything. Henry VIII wasn't just a fan of Renaissance music, he was a full-on musician. In fact, he was the complete singer-songwriter package. The guy could compose music, belt out a lovely tenor, and even sight-read like a pro. But Henry didn't limit himself to solo acts. No, this king loved a good duet with his pals, proving he was the ultimate Renaissance-era jam buddy. Henry owned a massive collection of musical instruments, including a staggering 154 recorders and 19 viols, all decked out with precious metals. 154 recorders? What was he doing, stocking up for an elementary school music class? A big fan of the lute, Henry also played the virginals, a kind of harpsichord popular in his day. Some say Henry wrote the classic tune Greensleeves as a young man, but considering it didn't rise to fame until after his death, it might have been more of a "I totally wrote that song," kind of like claiming to have a girlfriend who goes to a different school. Henry's contemporaries like to remember the king's body count as being somewhere in the neighborhood of 57,000 to 72,000 executions. Those numbers are almost definitely exaggerated, but it is true that Henry executed a lot of people. You couldn't even criticize Henry's marriage without being considered guilty of treason. Ironically, the act of succession required everyone to take an oath recognizing Anne Boleyn as the rightful queen, and all her children as legitimate heirs to the throne. Evidently, Henry himself never took that oath, as he had Anne executed and their daughter declared illegitimate after Anne failed to give him the son he wanted. But that's not all. Henry also executed heretics, potential rivals to the throne, the associates of both his doomed wives, the leaders of the uprising called the Pilgrimage of Grace, and Thomas Cromwell. The real number of dead probably never reached 1,000, though that's still an awful lot of heads. If your funds are limited, you usually don't enjoy squandering them on things that can only bring embarrassment. Henry had no such qualms. He liked war, even though he was bad at it. Granted, he probably only liked war because he thought there would be financial gain or power at the end of it, but he never seemed to figure out that war did nothing for him except cost him a lot of money. During Henry's reign, he attempted to conquer Scotland, which ticked off the Scots and encouraged them to ally with France. Meanwhile, Henry alienated the Holy Roman Emperor, who was his first wife's nephew. And when you alienate your allies, they generally don't want to help you fight your dumb wars. Henry went to war with France 3 times, though. By the 3rd time, he was so overweight he couldn't ride a horse anymore and had to be carried to the battle lines on a litter. By the end of the war, he'd gained the port of Boulogne, but he was practically bankrupt, so it wasn't even worth it. Then, as if to double down on the wasted campaign, Henry's son Edward sold the port back to France after Henry was dead. So, after all the deeply unsettling things we've learned about Henry VIII today, it's time for a slightly more relatable fact about the king. Henry VIII was actually a dog person. That's right. Like many kings of his era, and maybe like some of you out there, he had a plethora of pets. But it wasn't just any pet that captured Henry's heart. It was his beloved dogs, including greyhounds and beagles. These were no ordinary dogs, though. Henry treated them like royalty, decking them out in velvet collars and tiny silk coats. To make sure his dogs didn't get too bitey with people, Henry put them on a strict keto diet. Yes, keto, but not the kind we're familiar with. His dogs dined exclusively on bread, with no meat in sight. And because his love for his pets knew no bounds, Henry was even known to pay handsomely to anyone who found and returned his beloved dogs, Meatball and Beatrice. Now, just to clarify, those names aren't exactly historical fact, but I like to think Henry would approve. So what do you think about Henry VIII? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, don't forget to like and subscribe for more fascinating historical insights.